I wanted to share with you a couple of descriptions. New Age rubbish. You obviously don't know the Bible. I'd question where your theology degree came from. Just stop, please. These people are preparing the way for the Antichrist to unite us all. Do you know who they're talking about?
You.
Yes. They're talking about us and me in particular. My inspiration for today came from noticing something starting to happen. As you know, we have a YouTube channel and various other pages on social media platforms, and I started to notice this. This is the screen that I see when I log into YouTube. It shows me the videos that we've produced. This is a selection of them. And it shows you on this column on the right-hand side the likes versus the dislikes. And you start to notice that there are more dislikes creeping in to the videos that we're showing. And I came to realise this is actually a sign of success. It's actually a sign of success. There are people noticing what we're doing, what we're saying. Now, as a young minister, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, straight out of theological college, I had this idea that all we really needed to do was present the teachings of the church to people and they'd come flocking in the doors. It would be fairly easy to do as long as we expressed the truths and expressed them in the right way. Well, 25 years later, it hasn't quite happened that way. So, my question is, what should our reaction be to this? Do we need to repackage our truths? Or indeed, should it even deter us from speaking the truth? I have to admit, my natural tendency is to seek to please people, to seek people's approval. So when faced with this kind of thing, I have traditionally found it quite hard, quite difficult to face, and my tendency is to withdraw. I want to say that sort of my natural attitude to please and seek approval has its uses. So it's certainly true that the language we use to express a truth can sometimes make the difference between its acceptance or its rejection. So that is certainly true. And we have within the teachings of the church this idea we call accommodation, which is so very important to us. And that is very simply that none of us can grasp divine truth in its essence. It needs to be accommodated to our way of understanding. And that's not only true of you and I, it's true of every person in the world. However, the tendency to seek approval and the tendency to want to please others has its problems. I realise that if we continue, as is my natural bent, to seek to please others, to only say what is palatable to them, in the end, what happens? We just end up shutting down and shutting up. We say nothing, we quietly fade away. So I want to take that situation and just examine it for a few moments. And I want to share a couple of principles with you from the teachings of the church about this situation we find ourselves in. So the first thing is that there are two oppositions that we need to be aware of. Evil and falsity oppose what is good and what is true. And by that I mean that evil and falsity actively oppose what is good and what is true. So for example, we turn to the word. The name Satan, it means adversary. Adversary. Now, in a few weeks' time, we're going to look at the book of Zechariah. In Zechariah chapter 3 verse 1, Satan is mentioned standing as the high priest's adversary. Okay, so that's the meaning of the name Satan. And this is what evil and falsity does. It opposes what is good and what is true. But there's another opposition, and that is what is external opposing what is internal. Now, we see that in the Exodus reading that I brought to you earlier this morning, in the veil of Moses. If you remember, when Moses went and spoke to the Lord and he came down the mountain, his face was shining. And the children of Israel were afraid of it. And you can imagine it would be a strange scene, wouldn't it? Moses, this familiar figure, coming down the mountain, and here is his face glowing. So Moses puts this veil over his face so the children of Israel don't have to see it. But it's representative of this opposition of external things against what is internal. So just bear that opposition, those two oppositions in mind. What is evil and false against what is good and true. What is external against what is internal. Now we have to realise that we need to expect some form of opposition. So I read in Matthew chapter 10 what the Lord said, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher, and a servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call those of his household?" And then earlier in Matthew's Gospel, right at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, at the end of the Beatitudes, we have these words, I'm sure you're familiar with them. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, it's not a straightforward picture when we talk about these two oppositions. Not all evil opposes all good. Any evil will tolerate a certain amount of good depending upon whether it's valuable to it, whether it helps it achieve its own ends. And we are in reality a mixture, all of us, of goods and evils, truths and falsities. As we exist in this world, that's what we are. And so we have in Matthew's Gospel again, chapter 13, we have the parable of the harvest where the Lord says this, "The servant said to him, 'Do you want us to go and gather them up?'" That's gathering up in the weeds. "And he said, 'No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow until the harvest. And at the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" So we are this mixture. It's not a simple and straightforward picture. Okay, second principle I want to point out. Good and truth do not oppose evil and falsity. Now that doesn't sound right. That's counterintuitive. But here's the thing. So good must always be entirely consistent with itself. That's the main principle behind anything that is good, and the same is true of truth. It must be entirely consistent with itself, and kind of nothing else really matters. So we have things, again, Matthew's Gospel. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord says a tree is known by its fruit. So the tree will always produce its own kind of fruit. It doesn't produce anything else. So good must always be entirely consistent with itself. Its job is not to oppose. Its job is simply to be. So good never attacks. It always only defends. We don't need to defend the truth. We don't need to defend the truth. Think about this. You meet an insane person. I've met one or two. Do you feel the need to defend reality to an insane person? No, you don't. Reality just is. The fact that they can't see that it's reality is their problem, but you don't need to defend it. And that's truth. Truth is reality. You don't need to defend the truth. We take pity on people who are insane. But we know that if we spend hours and hours arguing with them, we're never going to get anywhere. It's not going to make any difference because they have their fixed ideas about what is real and what is true. So we also, when we look at the teachings of the church, we have this principle that the Lord never casts anyone into hell. Now, a lot of Christians have a great deal of difficulty with that idea. The Lord never casts anyone into hell or casts them out of heaven. And the reason is that the evil do it themselves. Now, I don't know whether you noticed this, but in Exodus, earlier in the reading, it said this, "For I will cast out the nations before you and enlarge your borders." Now that's according to the appearance. That's according to the way we understand the Lord works. He casts out. But notice what it says next. "Neither will any man covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord your God 3 times in the year." Now if we look at that in a literal sense and we think it's talking about the nation of Israel, that never really happened. The fact is that little strip of land has always been coveted by many different groups of people. It's speaking about a spiritual principle. And the spiritual principle is that evil does not covet what is good. Evil desires something entirely different. So good has no need to attack evil. Evil exposes itself and rejects what is good itself. Isaiah chapter 53, speaking about the Lord, it says this, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth." From Matthew 10. "We are sent out as sheep in the midst of wolves." And we must always act as sheep, never as wolves. Judgment, the process of judgment, is a bringing to awareness. So truth reveals the nature of evil and falsity, not because it condemns it, but because evil and falsity rejects the truth. You see what's going on here? The truth stirs a reaction, and that reaction is either acceptance or it is rejection. And that's the process of judgment. So again, Matthew chapter 10 says, "You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles." We have the prophet Jeremiah, who was thrown into the dungeons because of what he was saying. And there's this lovely passage in Jeremiah chapter 20, where he says this, "Then I said, I will not make mention of him, of the Lord, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in my heart like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I could not." And then we have the trial of Jesus. Imagine, if you remember what took place in Jesus' trial. He said not a word, and yet we see clearly laid out before us the nature of his accusers. In John's Gospel, we have a lovely little definition of the process of judgment in chapter 3. And this is the condemnation: that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. Now, there is within us an opposition to the truth. There is a doubt and an uncertainty and a lack of conviction which needs to be overcome. Where this affects us most deeply is where we ourselves have that sneaking suspicion that our opponents might actually be right. And it's that we really need ourselves to address before we can then start speaking the truth to others. See, the evil and falsity in our own hearts is every bit as oppositional as the evil and falsity present in the hearts of others. So, what should we flee from? I wonder whether you notice this. It said this in Matthew's Gospel, again, chapter 10, verse 23, "When they persecute you in this city, flee to another." Now compare that then a few verses later on where it says this, "Therefore do not fear them." And if we read beyond where we got to this morning, it says, "Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." Now, who is this strange person who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell? The traditional answer to that is it's Satan. The thing about that is it's only true of Satan if I let him. It's me. I am the one who is able to destroy my own soul and body in hell, if I so choose. So that is whom I am to fear, myself. So when it comes to what we're talking about in terms of fleeing, when they persecute you in this city, flee to another. What we have to remember is that proximity in the spiritual world is according to likeness or affinity, and distance is according to dissimilarity. So the thing that we are to flee from is being or becoming like those who oppose the truth. So that's what we are to flee, and that's something within ourselves. I've got something here from the teachings of the church, from Heavenly Secrets. But holy fear is not so much a fear of hell and of damnation as a fear lest anything whatever be done or thought that is contrary to the Lord and contrary to the neighbour. Thus anything whatever that is contrary to the good of love and to the truth of faith. The only fear that the angels have is a fear that they themselves might do damage. So that's what we're to flee. That's what we're to leave. I said before, the Lord said He sends us out as sheep among wolves. We're not to become like the wolves. Our actions always need to be consistent with the nature of goodness. We must remain loving and kind. But we should not expect that loving kindness to be returned to us. It won't necessarily be the case. Again, Matthew's Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, lots of good lessons in here. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For He makes His sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." Should it deter us from speaking the truth? No. No, I think that's pretty obvious, isn't it? Many years ago in Canberra, we had a little Bible study group, and we had a group of people from the old Apostolic Church came and joined us, looking at, I think it was John's Gospel off the top of my head. And I remember one of the guys who came along to the group, he talked about the idea of testimony. To give testimony in a court of law, all you do is speak the truth as you see it. And that's all you can ever do. Speak the truth as you see it. And so when he talked about Christian testimony, that is exactly what it was. To speak the truth as you see it. When we're talking about speaking the truth to people who oppose an idea, go back to your insane person, the person who doesn't believe the world is as it is. The only reason we ought to speak the truth to that person is out of love for them and concern for them. And that's our reason for speaking the truth. And then just to understand that this reaction that we see from other people is just part of the process. There are going to be people who react against the truths that we have to share. And we just must recognise that's the case. But perhaps, over time, the Lord can work in their lives and in ours to establish that reality in our lives.